So it was a bit of it was a genuine question. I actually didn't know they had done that. So when you said
Mhm.
that, but it was a bit of a setup insofar as that was exactly sort of my point. I had a few reactions. So the first is we'll get to this in a second, but Microsoft, of course, had to have their counter announcement out there talking about agents, and so they have a blog that they produced talking about their agent studio, and they said something similar that it's going to be like having a spreadsheet, and honestly, when my sort of note to myself when I was reading this article, it's like that is terrifying as an IT person. I'm going
Yeah.
to have tens of thousands of these agents running around and business users just creating them willy nilly, and I think there's all kinds of potential challenges with that. And I asked about the wow in part because I think right now this is a classic case of a whole lot of hype, and we'll see how that actually starts playing out in reality when we start having to operationalize it.
Mhm.
And I'm reminded of when Siri first came out, and we had people like Larry Ellison and Mark Benioff and others going out there on stage and saying, "Oh, look, we can ask Siri this, and it will do it. It connects to our system and does all these things." And of course, none of that really ever became a reality, mostly because nobody had a use for it. So I think it's really curious. The other big takeaway I had in looking at this was a few things. One is how big of a pivot that Salesforce is making around this. They are maybe not quite betting the company, but they are coming close to how much emphasis they put on this. I also find it interesting that normally when there's a big user conference like this, they save the big announcement for the show floor or for the
Mhm.
rather the keynote stage. And in this case, we've been talking about Agentforce for what, a month? I mean, they
They
telegraphed
telegraphed it.
this.
They just threw it out there hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you and Shane were talking about it last week. I mean, so it is also really interesting, and I don't know if that's a sign that they felt they had to get in front of this, that it was more. That one I find really kind of fascinating. And then the third big sort of aha, and I know you in our free talk for the show, you mentioned that they were doing this. That when I read through all the press releases and what have you, it's like it was very clear that there is a big fat bullseye painted on the back of Microsoft as far as Salesforce is concerned for this, which is also interesting because we've talked in the past about Salesforce clearly moving more and more into becoming a data platform and having much broader aspirations than just the traditional CRM space. But this full kind of frontal assault on Microsoft, I think, is quite fascinating.
Yes, and I think the Microsoft thing comes from several different angles. First of all, that Salesforce's real growth is happening through the data cloud. We keep talking about this every quarter that the CRM business seems to be growing about 5% per year, and the data cloud, Tableau and MuleSoft is all growing like 20% per year. So it doesn't take a math genius to figure out which one is growing more consistently and more quickly. But I also think that there has definitely been this realization that Microsoft is taking away a lot of Salesforce's growth in certain areas, such for instance with Slack. What ended up killing Slack as the market undisputed market leader in its space? Teams, because Microsoft was just happy to come in and pound Teams down everybody's throat and make it part of Office and just make it part of that Microsoft contract. So Salesforce knows that Microsoft has this power to basically provide services for either free or for a very low amount and basically break up anything that Salesforce is trying to do. So I think Salesforce sees Microsoft not quite as an existential threat, but really as the big obstacle to for Salesforce to monetize AI. So they are getting in front of it right now.
So that's what I find interesting about this is I look at ServiceNow as a much greater competitor. I look at some of the other major players as potentially large competitors here. Clearly, if you're trying to go after the AI assistant slash agent space with Microsoft's Copilots, obviously, it was fascinating to see Benioff just going after the Copilot space. Like, oh, we're past the Copilot era. It's like we haven't even started the Copilot era. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But clearly, that was this, attack on Microsoft. So in that regard, that's true. And clearly, I think there's egg on their face with Slack on how they just had their lunch taken from them with Teams. But elsewhere, I mean, there is not even a competition really with Salesforce and the Microsoft Dynamics. I mean, not really, right? There's really
Mhm.
no competition with the Tableau and Power BI. I mean, there's really, so if I look at like the core where you see Salesforce going, I don't really view Microsoft as a primary competitor in these core spaces. But this sort of what this speaks to is that Salesforce is clearly seeing AI as sort of trumping all else
Mhm.
and wanting to go after that space. We'll see. I mean, I think I'm not sure I'm convinced that Salesforce is going to be able to win in that entirely. But I will say I think the big weakness that Microsoft has always had is that AI is data centric, and from an enterprise perspective, it's enterprise data centric.
Mhm.
And Microsoft has all of the enterprise productivity space, but really very little of the actual AI data estate other than the Azure cloud, which of course then has everything running in it.
Mhm.
And so as I look forward and say, how do I contextualize, how do I monetize and operationalize my AI platform? I do think the major players of the current sources of record, the potentially the Salesforce, the Oracle, the SAPs, the ServiceNows, are in a better position to harvest that data simply, which is where I think the don't do the DIY messaging sort of works, but there's so much ground to cover on it that this feels a little bit like AI washing in that they're just oversimplifying how hard this stuff really is.
Yeah, and with Microsoft, they might not have the easiest solutions to use, but I think Microsoft has been pushed to provide a little bit more visibility into how the data works. And they do have some of these foundational data tools such as SQL Server. It's obviously hard to do analytics without SQL, and Microsoft is able to provide a little bit of extra visibility there, where Salesforce will literally say, you don't have to worry about that engine. You don't have to worry about the analytics or how any of this is actually done, as long as we get you from start to finish and you can define the task that you want to get done. I do think that if you put uh, Satya Nadella and Mark Benioff in a pit right now, there would be some bloodshed. um, there is some definite bad blood there. But you also reminded me with ServiceNow that Benioff had a funny quip about a month ago saying that Salesforce was like McDonald's and ServiceNow was like Wiener Schnitzel. And if you haven't been to the West Coast, Wiener Schnitzel is like this hot dog chain. It's little, it's regional. It's not even In and Out. It's like it's like the next thing down from In and Out from a size and notoriety perspective. So yeah, like Benioff is definitely het up about this right now.